George Washington, the father of America. His is a name all Americans know by heart. But do they really know him? Washington led an interesting life, and may be even more than the mythological figure he is built up to be. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in the British colony of Virginia to Augustine and Mary Washington. After his father's death 11 years later, he inherited a small farm and 10 slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited a larger piece of land, renaming it Mount Vernon. George never got the formal education his half-brothers did, but instead was taught in small local schools in the colonies. After visiting the plantations of family members, Washington wanted to enter the life of the planter aristocracy himself. In 1749, he went to William and Mary to learn how to survey. 2 years later, he accompanied Lawrence to the Caribbean in hopes to cure his tuberculosis. Lawrence sadly died there, so George ended up inheriting his massive estate. In December of 1752, Washington was commissioned as a major in the Virginia militia. At this time, Britain and France were arguing over the Ohio River Valley. Washington was sent to negotiate with the Iroquois Confederacy, thus beginning the alliances of the French and Indian War. Washington soon took a small party of Virginian and Iroquois troops to ambush the French, leading a successful attack at Jumonville Glen, thus starting the French and Indian War. French and Canadian forces quickly retaliated and forced Washington into a surrender at the British Fort Necessity. During the war, Washington quickly rose through the ranks. Throughout the war, Washington insisted on attacking the French Fort Duquesne, given its strategic position on a crossroads of some rivers. In an assault he led on Fort Duquesne, Washington's forces actually scared off the French, leading to a friendly fire killing 14. Washington was successful nonetheless, leading Virginia to suffer the least from the war. After the end of the war, Washington retired to Mount Vernon. In 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, the young widow of a wealthy planter. Although they had no children together, they did raise Martha's 2 children, John and Patsy, from her previous marriage. It is likely Washington was unable to have children after contracting smallpox in 1751. This marriage granted George control over Martha's massive Custis estate, making him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. The Washingtons were quite successful planters, making their money through not only tobacco, but also wheat, flour, fishing, and distilleries. In 1774, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. Washington called these, quote, an invasion of our rights and privileges. On April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, the American Revolution began. On June 14th, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief over the Continental Army. When Washington arrived to see the army, he found that they were badly disciplined. He enacted reforms by creating strict rules and consequences. During the early parts of the war, Washington faced many disagreements with Congress, such as his opposition to invading Canada or his proposal to invade Boston. After the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Washington's forces toppled an equestrian statue in New York City of King George III to turn it into ammunition. Sadly, Washington lost New York to the Redcoats shortly thereafter. The Continental Army soon retreated to New Jersey. In December of 1776, George Washington led one of his most famous maneuvers. British allied Hessian forces held Trenton, New Jersey. General Washington took boats full of his men across the Delaware River on Christmas night and successfully ambushed the Hessians. The capture of 800 to 900 Hessian mercenaries brought a much-needed morale boost to the Patriots. In early January, Washington led another successful attack on the British in Princeton. Washington's momentum was stopped with major defeats at Brandywine, Germantown, and Saratoga. December of 1777 brought Washington's all-time low. At Valley Forge, his forces of about 11,000 were reduced to 8,000 or 9,000 due to the bitter cold. Early in 1778, Friedrich von Steuben came to Washington's aid, whipping his army into shape. In 1779, Washington shifted his focus to the south. He led raids on the Iroquois, hoping to knock them out of the war. In January of 1780, the British commander Henry Clinton took Charleston. Although things seemed pretty bad, Washington got some relief upon learning the Marquis de Lafayette had brought back plenty of French troops, led by Marshal Rochambeau and Admiral Grasset. In October of 1781, Washington coordinated with the French to attack General Cornwallis at Yorktown. The American and French forces decisively won the battle, forcing Britain into negotiations and granting American independence. After winning the Revolutionary War, Washington stepped down, advising Congress to retain a standing army just in case. During the early days of the American Republic, Washington stayed at his home in Mount Vernon. In 1787, he was called to serve again at the Constitutional Convention. After nomination by Benjamin Franklin, Washington was unanimously elected as president of the convention. Here, Washington worked closely with James Madison to create the Constitution we still use today. In 1789, George Washington became the first president with a majority of votes in every single state. John Adams, who came in second, was elected his vice president. Although he planned to resign after one term, political turmoil convinced him that he had to stay for another to keep the nation together. Washington's presidency was full of numerous significant events. I hope to go over them in a future video, but I don't have the time to do so here. To summarize, Washington's various decisions and appointments throughout his presidency set the precedent used for all subsequent presidents. Washington knew that he had to stop at 2 terms, lest he die in office and set the standard that a president is in office until his death. When he retired, he gave a farewell address emphasizing the importance of national unity. George Washington then retired back to Mount Vernon, where he lived peacefully until dying at the age of 67 on December 14th, 1799. To this day, George Washington is properly remembered as an American hero. Although his military career wasn't always the most successful, he ultimately was the only man who could have won American independence. Even though he only made it to the equivalent of a modern 3-star general, he was posthumously awarded the title of General of the Armies, which is one of 3 men with that honor. George Washington's political decisions created the America we know and love today. It is thanks to his heroism that the American ideal of liberty was not crushed 200 years ago. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Matthew, and I hope I'll see you next time.
Goodbye, goodbye, wet a tear, baby dear, from your eye. Though it's hard to part, I know, I'll be sick of the death to go. Don't cry, don't sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky. Once more, old sing cheerio, chin chin, na boo toodaloo, goodbye.